And this is the idea that another person or group is diabolic or devilish.
Mm.
And you mentioned an example before.
I did. For example, the Nazi Party referring to Jews as rodents or rats.
Or fleas.
Or fleas.
And it is a reality that in genocide, the other, the enemy, is almost always referred to as vermin, as some kind of despicable creature. If you look, you don't have to go very far back in history to see people with black skin being considered a separate species from people with white skin. And this has been thoroughly debunked by genetics now, but this is only, genetics has only been able to do this really, I think it was in the 1950s that the first proofs started to come in. And we now know that we're all black, but some of us are a lighter shade of black that we do derive from a common ancestor. Not going to get into the mitochondrial Eve 238,000 years ago as the common ancestor of all of humanity, because Yuval would probably tell me off for saying such a thing. But that was certainly 20 years ago, that was what we believed. The idea of, Hitler, as we've mentioned him, and any YouTube must mention him within 30 seconds of starting, or it's not a proper YouTube, that Hitler believed that he belonged to a superior Aryan race of tall, godlike, blue-eyed, blonde-haired people, though he was himself 5'3", had brown hair and brown eyes. But his conviction was sufficient to persuade tens of millions of Germans and a fair few Finns and Bulgarians as well, if we are going to be wide-ranging in this, that he was somehow personified some great racial type. But he said that if you want to bring a group together, you have to create an enemy. And demonization is a standard way of doing this. The Institute for Krishna Consciousness, or whatever it's called, ISKCON, which I'm scared this week to see that the leader of the Krishnas in the UK is actually the representative of the Hindu Temples Association. It's a bit frightening. They, in their bad old days, because they're now completely reformed, would call anybody who criticised them a deadly demon. Scientology calls anyone who criticises them a suppressive person, or indeed an antisocial personality, to suggest that locking a 5-year-old in the chain lock of a ship is wrong would make you an antisocial personality. It's a standard way of getting around logic. You just say, well, they're not Christians, they're heathens.
What's the one in my religion?
I don't know.
Someone else's problem.
Someone else's problem.
Right.
But that's a pretty mild way of viewing it. I'm not going to get involved, as opposed to that person deserves to be murdered.
I mean, there's a similar idea to demonization in sociology through Howard Becker's idea of labeling. That if somebody's labelled a certain way and they're treated that way by society, so for example, a criminal who's just come out of prison and telling people that is likely to be seen different had he not done that.
And we'd all be a bit more careful. So if you are a criminal and you just come out of prison, please tell us.
Please tell us. It was taken a bit to the extreme side where it says criminality is completely socially constructed.
Well, let's talk about something that we know about. For a change.
Okay.
Delayed sleep-wake disorder. Up until a couple of years ago, it was thought that less than 2% of the population have a fixed sleep clock, which means that they go to sleep late and they wake up late. And that is because of the release of melatonin in the brain, which puts you to sleep, and hypocretin or orexin, which wakes you up. And I had a discussion this is bad, isn't it? I had a discussion with a professor of neurology who was explaining to me that the waking drugs are completely irrelevant. And then they changed the name of the disorder to delayed sleep wake phase, and he had to tell me, which he had, he was kind enough to do. Now we know that about 20% of people naturally want to sleep late, and about 20% of people want to sleep early. The people who sleep early, well, the early bird catches the worm.
I don't want to catch worms, as you said.
That's what I said to my dad, who also had a delayed sleep phase, as I do. People will tend to battle with it because it is considered socially so unacceptable to live through the nighttime, because it means you're an ungodly person.
Yeah.
It means you're a devil worshipper.
You're lazy.
You're lazy. Lazy is the standard word. Those we sleep 7 or 8 hours the same as anybody else and work ourselves to death making these silly videos.
So difficult.
But there's this concept of the night person, the time of the zombies and what have you. That's an example of demonization where it's, not skin colour, but it's the time of day that your metabolism functions at. And if you try and change it, by the way, and all of this nonsense using blue light and melatonin tablets, it's a disruption of your metabolism. And you will very likely get digestive problems. There you go. We know about this. But people will be demonized. People will, because they are different in some way. For example, in the 1970s, in British society, there was a study of equality among different groups. And it was found that, white middle-class people, males, were actually at the top.
Yeah, as you'd expect.
Getting all the good stuff. But at the very bottom, while West Indians and Africans were not being treated as well, Asians, it tended to depend whether they were East Asians, in which case they'd be treated slightly better, or Southeast Asians, or South Asians. There are all sorts of categories. What was fascinating to me about this was that the people who were most despised, who had the shortest lifespan, the worst health care, and the worst education in our society were none of the above. They were Irish people, because of an inherent prejudice against the Irish. Now, let's face it, one of the genocides was performed in the 17th century by a man called Oliver Cromwell, around about 1650, and his statue is outside our Parliament, along with the other mass murderer, Richard the Lionheart, sitting there going, this is what we represent in our democracy. Oliver Cromwell actually performed a genocide on Ireland, which is not enough talked about. He murdered thousands and thousands of people and exported others as slaves, actually, to the West Indies, where they mixed into the black African slave population and possibly had some slight thing to do with the origin of the blues. If Jimi Hendrix is to be believed, when he first heard Irish folk music, he said, that's the blues. Not Scottish folk music, just like to make the differentiation there. There are no bagpipes in the blues.
But can we believe him? He was an 8th Irish, after all.
It's true. He was an 8th Irish, he was an 8th Cherokee. So demonising people because of the way they look, the way they sound, the colour of their skin, as opposed to, as Martin Luther King said, the content of their character. If you're going to treat people, get to know them and treat them according to that. And that's really important if we're going to have any kind of decent future on this planet. Unless we want to see a kind of hierarchy of races or some nonsense like that. And as you said previously, for any white supremacists who happen to have dropped in, I'm afraid your belief that the Scandinavian blood is pure blood has been proved wrong by archaeologists who have found burials where Sami or Laplander people are dressed in full Viking regalia, indicating that they too were members of that society. So bless them all. I'm John Atack and he's
Sam Atack.
And that's all we have to say about that.
I'm glad.
So thank you for your company and see you again soon. Goodbye.